Welcome back to eMarketer's Tech Talk, where we host guests of all areas of media, ad tech, and MarTech. I'm Nancy Tefero-Santos, Senior Vice President, eMarketer Insider Intelligence. Thank you for joining us. Today, I will host a discussion on how to create data-driven transformation across the organization. From Berlin, I'd like to welcome Kristina Prokop, who is the co-founder and CEO of Eyeota. Kristina, good evening. How are you?
Hi, Nancy. Thanks. Doing very well. Thanks. Hope he's well. And thanks for having me here. Very excited to dig into this topic.
Absolutely. We're excited, and so is our audience. Before we get started, let me share a couple of things. First, we'll send a link to today's recording. Second, let your colleagues know that they can still join us. We simulcast across our social channels, so tell them to go there. And lastly, we love your participation. During the presentation, send us questions, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A, so just keep them coming. Kristina, we can't wait to hear about data. Over to you.
Well, I'm glad somebody gets as excited about data as I do. That's a nice for a change sometimes. So it's wonderful to be here hosting this webinar in which we're going to talk about onboarding's role in future-proofing first-party data strategies. Now, onboarding, as many of you know, has been a part of brands and marketing advertising strategies for years. But the importance of finding ways to collect and activate first-party data has increased drastically over the last year. So today we're going to talk about ways to look at how onboarding can be used as a primary foundation to create robust first-party data strategies that are consumer-friendly and built to last in a cookieless world. We're going to focus on three main areas today. First, the current industry changes, including the sunsetting of third-party cookies and their impact on data strategies. Second, the challenges that brands and marketers now face to really rebuild data strategies that now will comply with consumer privacy and the new landscape. And last but certainly not least, how cohort-based onboarding solves for these challenges with a consumer-friendly and scalable solution, which will future-proof data strategies. So what are the changes that brands and marketeers are navigating through today? If you ask me, I think it's way too many. Brands have been really faced with a dizzying pace of change, and that pace has continued to accelerate over the last couple of years. I don't really need to go into the detail of the list that starts with the deprecation of third-party cookies, Apple's IDFA updates, and evolving privacy regulations. The reality is that this pace will not decelerate in the near future. So the challenge is that with all the latest raft of changes, brands have to take stock of their data assets and reevaluate all of these strategies and technologies and methods they have developed over the last decades to ensure that they will also be ready for the future. Now, when it comes specifically to data, this is resulting in an increased focus on building first-party data strategies that will not be dependent on third-party cookies and will give brands full control and transparency around privacy and impact on the consumer. For most brands, this is the beginning of a journey. And to be honest, it's really for the entire ecosystem. All of us will be impacted, and all of us have to work together to find solutions. And it will be key to build strategies that are flexible, consumer-friendly, and will be able to accompany your business for years to come. So what is the problem we face today? The challenge right now is closing the gap, and that's the gap between the strategic importance of first-party data and where brands currently are in the process of building out their strategies today. We recently commissioned Forrester Consulting to conduct a study on marketing leaders' current data priorities and practices to better understand where brands are along this journey of building first-party data strategies and executing on them. The study found that while 70% of decision makers understand the value of first-party data, 48% were unable to leverage their first-party data sources effectively. And only 44% we're investing in platforms or services related to first-party data. This means that brands really have to accelerate their investment and focus in order to get in front of the curve instead of lagging behind it. The other real challenge that brands face with their first-party data is scale. Not every brand has been focused on building out proprietary data assets, and many have only been using first-party data for very specific use cases where scale isn't necessarily the goal. However, due to the upcoming changes, now they really need to find ways to build scale. Brands have traditionally used third-party data or other sources to provide the scale and maturity that their first-party strategies, that their first-party data lacked. So the question is, how will the brands go about filling that gap? And how will they find ways to use our first-party data for scale? Brands have to begin rethinking the application of first-party data and using it as a base to build consumer profiles that can be used across many more disciplines than they are today. So if you look at traditionally, the use cases for first-party data have been primarily focused on existing customers. Brands use a one-to-one match to locate an offline customer in an online environment, onboard their data, and create segments that are utilized for things like personalization, customer retention, and cross-sell and upsell opportunities. But now, as brands search for ways to reduce the reliance on third-party data, they need to focus on effective ways to use their first-party data for additional tactics, like driving new customer acquisition. So what is next? What's up next? It is time for brands to start exploring new ways of scaling their first-party data, using their data to drive prospecting and upper funnel activity. They also need to use their data to fill knowledge gaps. And this can be used to improve the customer experience for all customers, not only those that they're able to recognize in a logged-in environment. So when it comes to first-party data, more is more. Looking at all of the data and harnessing all of those assets in the organization and putting them to work for you is what is going to drive success. Brands should incorporate data from all offline and online sources, and they need to do that to build the scale and depth that their first-party data has traditionally lacked. If you consider how we behave as consumers, our interactions with a brand span multiple points of consideration and action that absolutely are not limited by channel. So therefore, your data strategies should also reflect that. Now I want to talk you through some practical applications. There are activation strategies that are based on one-to-one or deterministic onboarding, which most of you are familiar with. What I want to introduce is the concept of using these varied sources of first-party data to create powerful audience cohorts. And the onboarding process can leverage a variety of data sources that hold the value of the behavioral patterns of your current and future customers. Looking back at that list that we just saw of what's next, we discussed for brands, it's about finding methods to use our first-party data to power more effective upper funnel activity, filling in the knowledge gaps, and using their data at scale. And this is where cohort onboarding methodologies win. Integrating offline and online data unlocks new opportunities and provides a tailored customer experience and can enhance communication across digital and traditional channels and develop marketing campaign assets. So many of you have heard this word. I know a lot of us, we hear it in the news. It's cohorts. It is becoming a marketing buzzword of 2021, primarily because we've heard it used in Google's use of flocks or introduction of flocks, which is their interest-based advertising opportunity that will replace third-party cookie-based targeting. Flocks, for those of you who don't know, really stands for the Federated Learning of Cohorts. But what exactly are cohorts? They're a clustering of large groups of people with similar characteristics. People are clustered in a way, and this is the important part, that is stripped of any PII and protects individuals' privacy by default. So let's take a moment to discuss what types of offline data may exist in your organization. What data is available can vary greatly from brand to brand, as you can imagine. However, it's very likely that you at least have access to a few of the following. You might have research data, customer information purchased from data providers such as market research groups. You could have purchase data, or examples, data from merchant networks or cash-based interactions. Survey data, information from after purchase surveys and satisfaction questionnaires. CRM data, which I would guess almost all of you have as a cornerstone of your business. And loyalty and rewards programs, where preference and purchase data that customers are happy to share in order to receive benefits from. The more brands we help uncover the potential of these offline data assets, the more we know and understand that the likelihood of all of these sources being disparate and not connected in any way today is very high. So the opportunity is using all of these offline data sources, either independently or in unison, to aggregate the attributes into high propensity cohorts, which identify highly correlating user clusters. So simply said, it's really finding the commonality between different customer traits and their behavior. Once the data has been used to build audience cohorts, an onboarding partner will take this data to map the offline attributes to a compliant online profile and create digital audiences. The final product is a proprietary customer target profile based on intelligence that only you as a brand hold. Data that helps drive new customer prospecting, consumer-friendly engagement, and effective interest-based advertising that none of your competitors have access to. When it comes to finding new customers, the more varied data sources you use to build the cohorts, the better. The more varied the sources are, the more powerful the insight into customer behavior is. So if you think about it, the more variance you have, the more it will allow you to create diversified cohorts based on behavior, interests, purchase intent, and life stage. And using multiple attributes really results in a better reflection of your customer base rather than using a fixed set of lookalikes. Once you've successfully built audience cohorts, the question becomes, what strategies can they power? Where can they provide you with unique intelligence? Once you've created scaled segments, you can use them to communicate to and target your customers and prospects, even in a non-logged in environment. You can use these clusters to find and acquire new customers. This is really one of the key application points and use cases that we see in market today. Cohorts can really be a very effective upper funnel tool. You can also increase interactions with customers to help build and grow your first-party data asset. You can increase campaign personalization and enhance marketing analytics, develop engaging results-driven campaigns, and optimize omnichannel communications. It's important to keep in mind that using audience cohorts can be applied to any digital identifier and is not dependent on third-party cookies. So to take all these concepts into a practical use case, I'd like to walk you through the example of a retailer. We'll give our retailer the name Greg's Groceries. So Greg's Groceries has a popular loyalty card program. Customers very freely use this card frequently and are happy to give Greg's Groceries user data that they can use to provide them with offers catered to their preferences. So of course, Greg's Groceries can easily understand what products individual customers are buying and use that information to market to them. That is what your typical one-to-one boarding use case is. So using the purchase and preference data, finding that same customer online, and personalizing their offers and advertising targeting. However, what about targeting new customers and prospects using that same loyalty data set? When Greg's Grocers took a step back and looked at the data at a higher level, there was actually a very extremely valuable additional insight that was used for onboarding. They can see that there was a very clear propensity based on the data points like gender, postal code, and purchase activity. And the data ended up showing very clearly that females in 150 specific postal codes highly over-indexed on their propensity to buy organic products. So rather than using traditional one-to-one approach, or actually in addition to it, Greg's Grocers could use the data and onboard all of it to create meaningful, scalable audience cohorts that could be deployed for targeting the new customers. So once their data was organized and onboarded into cohorts and activated, the resulting segments were used to primarily acquire new customers. But they also did programs to send tailored offers through traditional and digital channels, strategically place advertisements resulting in more effective ad spend. And also, they were able to basically create this into a data product and monetize this privacy compliant cohort segment by offering it to CPG brands for campaign targeting. So now that we've discussed some of the application points of cohort-based methodologies, let's spend a moment and discuss why it's important to start developing multiple onboarding strategies. There's absolutely no question about the relevance and importance of one-to-one or deterministic onboarding. But the reality is it does face challenges. Because of increased privacy regulation, it will become increasingly difficult to scale. We already see these challenges in stricter markets across Europe. You have to imagine, in order to onboard one-to-one, you need consent from the consumer for the use of their personal information, such as a name, address, or email, for the purpose of onboarding and targeting. And we see this very large shift in consumer mentality right now. And as these consumers become more conscious of where they're sharing their email addresses or phone numbers and for what purposes, the scale potential and relevance of one-to-one will be affected. So, and if you look at cohort-based methodologies, on the other hand, they do not need personally identifiable information to onboard first-party data onto a digital identifier, and it will not be as heavily impacted by the same limitations. Where do brands start moving towards and becoming more mature in their strategies? So they will be considering all data sources and what mechanisms and technologies that they can use to put those to best use. They will have processes and procedures in place to utilize both online and offline data to meet their target marketing objectives. I want to be very clear about one thing. This is not a situation of either or. This is really about a rounded, a cohesive data strategy, which understands when to use probabilistic cohorts or when to use deterministic one-to-one, and not to be reliant on just one approach. So where do we stand today in this first-party data journey? The answer is that we have a long way to go, but the future is very promising. And there's a lot of opportunity that hasn't been tapped, which is really the most exciting part. And in the same Forrester study I mentioned earlier, they also found that only 27% of marketing decision makers consider their data strategies to be mature. So the urgency of developing stronger first-party data strategies will undoubtedly accelerate this in focus over the next year. The key is making sure that you start exploring and building these strategies sooner rather than later. The organizations that have already realized the value of cohort methodologies and probabilistic onboarding, on top of any deterministic strategies, are going to be at a competitive advantage as cookies and other legacy identifiers disappear. So I'd like to reiterate something I highlighted earlier. It's not about either or. This is about a rounded, cohesive strategy, which understands when to use which methodology. So let's line these strategies up side by side to understand what the applications are. What about the use case? So on the one hand, while deterministic is used to target your existing customer base, cohorts deliver scaled audiences to primarily target new customers and prospects. Next, if you look at the difference in dependency on PII, while deterministic requires the collection of declared PII, like an email or phone number to match, probabilistic cohorts do not require PII to match. Next, let's look at where it can be used in terms of markets. Where can these methodologies be executed? So one-to-one is a very strong and advanced tactic in the US, but it is not as scaled in other markets. Still today, there's really only a few select markets outside of the US where one-to-one onboarding can be executed at scale. This makes a huge difference if you're a global brand looking for ways to roll out first-party data strategies across all of your markets. On the other hand, probabilistic cohorts provide a consistent global methodology. And last but not least, privacy. We'll line this up. So one-to-one is restricted where strict privacy regulations exist, while cohort-based methodologies are compliant with consumer privacy regulations across the globe. So we discussed many of the ins and outs of onboarding methodologies, use cases, and the advantages and disadvantages of the varying tactics. I hope that it's clear how important building a comprehensive and multi-pronged approach will be to brands strategically. So you may be asking yourself, in practice today, what should my next steps be in developing my first-party data and onboarding strategies? First and foremost, you need to perform a thorough data audit. Make sure that you understand all of the data sources you have, where they come from, review which of those data sources you rely on today that may be affected by the changes we've discussed coming tomorrow. Some of the questions you can ask yourself are, what kind of first-party data do I have? And how do I currently leverage it? How much of the marketing strategy is focused on retention versus new customer acquisition? Do you currently activate offline data? And which markets are you currently interested in? So second, create a clear outline of your data goals. What do you need this data to do? What gaps do you need to address? And where do you need to use the data? All of these have a big impact on how you build your strategies. And last but not least, work with partners and be open and explore. Work with them to better understand the various offerings and methodologies, where they should be applied, how they technically work, and what their exposure is to changes in technology, identity, and privacy that may be coming down the road. The most important thing is that you just get started. You just have to dig in somewhere, because the reality is these changes are coming quickly, and you really need to be prepared. So before I hand over to Nancy to discuss some questions that have come in from the audience, I'll walk you through a few key takeaways. First, we're in the middle of a massive shift. The way that brands can use data and execute consumer-friendly targeting strategies are evolving rapidly. So getting ahead of these changes will give you a strategic advantage. Data onboarding is more than just deterministic. Cohort-based methodologies can help you apply your first-party data to more tactics by creating privacy-compliant digital audiences for consumer-friendly engagement. And most importantly, brands need to build a future-proofed and flexible, mature data strategy that can be applied for multiple marketing and business needs, independent of the channel or type of identifier. So I'm really excited, Nancy, to hear what kind of questions came in from the audience, and I'll hand right back over to you.
Thank you, Kristina. This was very interesting, very helpful. I loved the example of Greg's Grocery, especially about not only targeting customers, but also targeting prospects. That was really interesting. And as you said, the data and privacy landscape is changing every day. It's so important for marketers and publishers to be up on this and be ready. So thank you, really appreciate it. And we do have some questions that came in, so let me get started there. Regina in North Hampton, New York would like to know, what IDs can I use if third-party cookies are disappearing?
It's an important question. This goes back to this multi-pronged approach. It really is going to depend on what type of data you have and what touch points you have with the consumer. So those could be things where it's feasible from a privacy perspective. That could be a hashed email address. The most important thing to remember, first-party cookies are not disappearing. We're really talking about third-party cookies. So you can build strategies off of them. There are also, universal ID providers that are helping to connect the dots in between different identifiers, and identity providers that also help stitch together. So it's really about first understanding what your touch points are and what those first-party data collection points are, and then how do you use those data points and connect them into the execution endpoints that you need to work with. And there can be a couple different avenues of how to do that, and providers that will help translate those IDs, which also our platform does within the ecosystem we work in. But really, no one should be afraid from the perspective of a brand or a publisher's first-party data that they won't be able to connect that to any sort of identifier.
Okay, thank you. And EJ in Chicago would like to know, how's it different from region to region? He says, I have different types of data in different regions. How does this work?
Yeah, so definitely, I think most brands see that the consumer behavior can vary greatly. So I'm not surprised by that piece of information. So generally, when we're looking at building cohort-based strategies for brands, we do look at them on a country-by-country basis. So it is important. There may be commonalities, and what could be very interesting is if you look at that data and there are commonalities, that means you can also apply those to markets where you might have less first-party data. So definitely, by all means, regions can be very, very different and should be handled as such.
Okay, thank you. And you touched on lookalike. Mark in London would like to know, how do cohorts differ from lookalike modeling?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, the value of using the multiple touch points that you receive from your first-party data on a consumer, using all these variables helps to create a much deeper picture and a truer picture of what that onboarded profile would look like. So you have to imagine you're using multiple data points with a larger seed set and applying that large audience set. You're onboarding a large audience set. The difference is with lookalike modeling, you're taking a very small selected seed, and you're using all types of different behavioral pieces that you see about them to make interpretations about who else might look like them. So it's really, the power and quality of a match with using more massive data to make that match is going to be effectively more relevant than trying to do a lookalike model.
Thank you. And Simone in Providence would like to know, what if I don't have a lot of first-party data?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think what we've also found through our conversations, some of the brands that are large brands, you would assume they have a lot of first-party data, but the reality is a lot of them don't. If you look at the auto sector, if you look at CPG, really having a large-scale first-party data asset that they own can be problematic. So the important point, if you really have none, obviously, is starting to figure out where will consumers be willing to interact with you and share information with you and start to help you creating that first party data asset. Now, if the asset isn't that large, but you do have high quality data, there's still a lot you can do with that. And that's actually where a cohort-based methodology can work much more effectively than a one-to-one onboarding. Because the very small scale, if you have a very, very small scale of one-to-one, it's hard, if you look at matching those, let's say you can find 30% of those users again, and then you target them into something else, you're really looking at cutting down a small user base to even a smaller number. But if you use a cohort-based methodology, you can use all of that first-party data to build models to help you understand what those users look like and apply that to a larger audience set.
Okay. And we have Aiken in Michigan who would like to know, how can we use cohort data in reaching users via channels like email, SMS?
Yeah, so this is about, I'll be honest with you, those channels we're not active in those channels right now. So it's a great question, and I would like to give it some thought. So if you are out there and you would like to contact me, I can definitely help you find ways to look at how you would activate in those channels.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And one last question here. Marco in Italy would like to know, could a geodemographic cluster be a cohort?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at some of the traditional data companies, that's really what they do. That's a lot of what their products are. They look at demographics in very specific geo regions, and they know a lot. I mean, they can say a lot about it. The neighborhood that somebody lives in, that can tell you a lot about their sociodemographic background. There's a lot of data about census data, auto ownership data. So all the data, yes, can be used and is considered cohort-based audience segmentation.
Okay, fantastic. And if you don't mind, I'd like to take this conversation another way. Kristina, I've been in awe over this presentation. We had a really nice conversation in the waiting room. 8% of CEOs as part of the Fortune 500 are females. I was watching a documentary last night with Melinda Gates, and women in tech have declined over the past 2 decades. You're a CEO in tech. You are a female leader in tech. Can you share any advice to other leaders and give us a little data set on how you did it?
Sure, I just did it. I don't know. There's no science behind this. You just have to dig in and get stuff done. And, I think one thing that I do tell people is you have to find the avenues where you're going to get the opportunities you want. And when you get them, you have to step up and take them. So yeah, I mean, for me, there's been no silver bullet. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of focus. It helps that I love what I do. And just, leading and working with determination and conviction and authenticity. And, I would say that's how I got where I am today. It's a different path for everyone, but it's really so much of it is just roll your sleeves up and do. Yeah, that's the best advice I can give.
Yeah, do and don't be afraid. You have a lot of courage.
No.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll tell you,
Incredible.
I love, there is a German saying that I absolutely love. It's one of these corny things. I mean, my dad was German, and he always came home with these translations of sayings that I always rolled my eyes at. But now that I live here and I'm in the same position, there's a very classic one. And the translation is, everybody just cooks with water. And I always think about that. So if you look at somebody else that is leading and doing great things and taking opportunities and building companies, they also only cook with water. You know, it's not that none of this is rocket science. You know, it's just getting up, seeing what the opportunities are and grabbing them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing with our audience. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
As I said, great content. Really appreciate you answering all those questions. This was just a very nice tech talk, so thank you. Before we wrap up, let me take a moment and tell everyone what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live tech talk and meet the analyst webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget our podcast, Behind the Numbers. And finally, please check out our newsletter. Keep an eye on your email. We'll send a link to today's recording and be sure to share it with your colleagues. Thank you again for your time, Kristina. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, for being a role model and a leader in our industry. Thank you, Katie, Laura, and the entire team at Eyeota. We'll see you all on our next Tech Talk. Until then, everybody, stay safe and mask up.